All right, so today we're going to dive into a massive change, one that completely reshaped England and, believe it or not, actually paved the way for the world we live in today. And the wild part, this whole revolution didn't kick off in some big noisy city. Nope, it all started out in the quiet countryside with farms and fences.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at what life was like in these open fields. Then, we'll see how putting up a few fences changed absolutely everything. After that, we'll get into some cool new farming tech, but also talk about the people who got left behind in all this progress. And finally, we'll connect the dots and see how this created a brand new world.
All right, first things first. To really wrap your head around just how massive this change was, you've got to picture what things were like before. So try to imagine this. You're in a village, and you're looking out at the fields, and they just stretch for miles and miles with pretty much no fences in sight at all.
Yeah, for centuries that was totally normal. It was called the open field system. And it's kind of weird to think about, right? Instead of one person having one big farm, a family might own a few little strips of land here, another one over there, all scattered around. And everyone's just farming right alongside their neighbors.
So you can see there were some pros and cons here. On the one hand, it was really a community effort. Everybody had access to this common land, so you could graze your cow or grab some firewood. But here's the catch. This system made it almost impossible to try anything new. If you came up with some brilliant new farming idea, you couldn't just go for it. Nope. You had to do what the rest of the village was doing, no exceptions.
And that's where things start to change. See, that exact problem, that lack of innovation, is what the wealthy landowners really started to zero in on. They basically said, hey, this old system, it's inefficient, it's holding us all back. And they came up with a pretty radical idea that was about to turn the countryside completely upside down.
And that was the enclosure movement. The name is super literal. Landowners literally started enclosing the land, putting up fences, walls, hedges. They took all those little scattered strips and all that shared common land, and bam, they combined them into these huge private farms. All of a sudden, the whole idea of sharing was out the window, and private property was the new name of the game.
So you might be wondering, how did this happen so fast? Well, at first, it was actually a really slow and expensive process. You had to get a special act from Parliament for each piece of land. But then, Parliament passed what were called the General Enclosure Acts, and that just threw gasoline on the fire. Things sped up like crazy. By the late 1800s, those open fields that had been around for centuries were pretty much gone.
Okay, so with all this new private land, something really cool started to happen. These new farms basically became giant laboratories for amazing new inventions. For the first time, farmers had total control over their land, so they could finally start experimenting with new ideas.
Okay, check this out. This is the seed drill, invented by a guy named Jethro Tull. Before this, farmers would just throw seeds out by hand. Super wasteful. Birds would eat a ton of them. But the seed drill, it was genius. It planted seeds in these perfect, neat rows at exactly the right depth. So simple, right? But it was an absolute game changer. Crop yields just went through the roof.
And it wasn't just tools, they changed their methods too. This is the 4-field crop rotation system. Now, in the old days, you always had to leave one of your fields empty, or fallow, just to let the soil rest and get its nutrients back. But with this new system, you could plant crops like turnips or clover that, get this, actually fed the soil, putting nutrients back in. What did that mean? No more wasted fields. You could grow food every single year, which meant more food for people and for the farm animals.
And they did the same thing with animals. Farmers like Robert Bakewell pioneered something called selective breeding. It's a simple idea. You only let your biggest and healthiest animals have babies. And the results were just staggering. Just look at this chart. The average weight of a bull more than doubled. It went from around 370 pounds to 800 pounds. That is a huge, huge difference.
Okay, but all of this progress, more food, bigger animals, everything being more efficient, it sounds great, right? Well, it came at a massive cost. For thousands upon thousands of regular farming families, this whole revolution was nothing short of a disaster.
Think about it. When that common land got fenced off, suddenly a small farmer had nowhere to graze his family's one cow. They couldn't afford the lawyers or even the cost of building fences for their own tiny plots. So, what happened? They were often forced to sell their land for next to nothing to the big landowners. And just like that, they went from being their own boss and independent farmer to just working for a wage. For so many, the only choice they had left was to pack up and leave the only home they'd ever known and try to find work in the growing city. And this huge movement of people, this mass migration from the farms to the cities, it didn't just change individual lives. It changed the entire country. It literally laid the foundation for the industrial world that we're all living in today.
First off, the landscape itself physically changed. Those endless open plains were gone, and in their place, you got that classic patchwork quilts of fields, separated by hedges and stone walls, the very thing most of us think of when we picture the English countryside. The land became organized, sectioned off, controlled.
You can really see the chain reaction here. It's a domino effect. Enclosure makes farming way more efficient, so you can grow more food with fewer people. Okay, so what happens to all the people who aren't needed on the farms anymore? They move to the cities looking for work. And what do they find in the cities? Brand new factories popping up everywhere that are desperate for workers. You see, the enclosure movement didn't just happen at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. It was the fuel that made the whole thing possible.
So this whole story of enclosure leaves us with a really big and kind of tough question. On one hand, it brought incredible progress and fed a growing nation. But on the other, it completely uprooted thousands of people from a way of life that had existed for generations. And it forces us to ask a question that's still super relevant. How do we balance the amazing benefits of new technology with the very real impact it has on people's lives? It's a challenge they wrestled with back then, and honestly, it's one we're still trying to figure out today.